Okay, well, it's Odyssey week in Humanities 101M. And so I have a series of videos this week, this one being the first of three, that will hopefully orient you to the book so that you have some sense of what you're getting into right away, and also give you some ideas about what to be looking for as you're reading. Of course, not only will you be given a quiz over much of this material at the end of the week, but there will also be an essay that you'll be writing. And the last of the three videos should be especially helpful for that. All right, well, this is the first real book that we're reading in Humanities 101. It's the first work of literature that we've read so far. And it's, of course, considered a classic, which really you could say of all of the works of literature that we're reading this semester. They're all classics. And I think it's worth then spending a little bit of time thinking about what we mean when we call a work a classic. I mean, it should strike you as slightly odd that a book written over 2,500 years ago, halfway around the world from us, is something that we're still reading today here in East Tennessee or wherever you are. The very fact that we're reading it suggests that, yes, this is a classic. But I think there's more to being a classic than just the fact that a work is still read today. I think there's more to it. Although that's certainly one of the criteria. You really can't call a book a classic if nobody reads it anymore. So a classic is a work that's been read over a long period of time, and usually in a variety of places. A second criterion for a classic would be then that a classic is something that transcends its own time and place. Right? So even if the Odyssey had been wildly or was only wildly popular in ancient Greece, but not at a later time, not anywhere else, we might call it a bestseller. We might say it was extremely popular in its own day and time, but we wouldn't call it a classic. Another characteristic, I think, of any work deserving of the name classic is not only that it is read over a long period of time, but that it is a source of inspiration for later writers. In the case of the Odyssey, also later artists and painters and filmmakers. You've seen "O Brother, Where Art Thou?" Then you've seen a pretty recent film that was inspired directly by the Odyssey. So classics are works that are not just read and digested, but that continue to inspire people who are writing and painting and making movies today. Two other things I think I would want to say about any work worthy of the name classic. I think a classic is by definition a work worth rereading. There are lots of books that are a great read one time through, and they're a blast to read, but you never really need to read them again, because if you read them again, it would just sort of fade, and there wouldn't really be anything new you would notice. There wouldn't be extra layers of meaning you would discover. It would just be kind of boring to read it again. Certainly you can think of movies about which that is true, or TV shows. But a classic, I think, is a work that is worth rereading because it's so artfully constructed that you cannot possibly imbibe all of its meaning or possible meanings on the first pass through. There's just too much to take in. So when you read a book a second or a third time, not only are you enjoying things that you enjoyed the first time around, but you're noticing things that escaped your notice the first time around. I think that is a mark of a classic. There's an Italian writer named Italo Calvino. He's dead now, I think. But he's got a really nice definition, I think, of a classic. According to Calvino, C-A-L-V-I-N-O, classics are books that are never finished saying what they have to say. I'll repeat that. Classics are books that never finish saying what they have to say. Right? So it's not like you could read something like Moby Dick and say, oh, okay, well, this is like the moral of Moby Dick. Here it is. Never need to read it again. No. These are works that continue to give meaning or allow the reader to make meaning every time that they are read. And sometimes, hopefully you'll find this out in your own experience. You know, you read a book in high school and it just bores you to tears, or you don't get it, or it just seems kind of silly. And you read it 10 years later, 15 years later, when you're in a very different stage of life. Maybe you have a child, you have other kinds of responsibilities, you just have more life experience, and all of a sudden the book has all this meaning that it didn't have. And that's a true mark of a classic. Finally, I would say that in order to term a work a classic, not only does it have to check all the boxes that I just mentioned, but it should be a work that really says something, and says something perceptive, if not profound, about what it means to be a human. And that, of course, is what the humanities program in Milligan is all about. This question of what does it mean to be a human. We're going to be grappling with this question all our lives, and classics are books that will give us some sustenance on that journey. Will give us food for thought, and give us a less inadequate idea about what it means to be a human. So we're assigning this book that's very old, that is the product of a culture radically different from our own. Why is it worth your time? Well, hopefully I've given you maybe some idea, at least, of why I think it's worth your time. So here's a few things I think you need to know before you read any of the Odyssey. I mean, if you've already started, that's fine, but I think what I want to say in the rest of this video, which will be hopefully quite short, will be things that just kind of orient you to the reading so that you're not going into it entirely cold. I think the first thing to know about the Odyssey is it is a kind of sequel. A kind of sequel to a book called the Iliad, which I expect many of you have heard of, if not read portions of. The Iliad is also attributed to Homer, and I'll talk more about Homer in just a moment. So you need to know a little bit about what happens in the Iliad. I think that's very helpful. The Iliad is really just looking at a period of 4 days during the 10th year of the Trojan War. Okay? Don't expect that you necessarily know anything about the Trojan War. Let's just suffice it to say, for the time being, that it's a war between a confederation of Greek people and the people of the city of Troy, which was located in northwestern Asia Minor, which is now the country Turkey. The war, I'm not going to go into all the mythology behind the war. I'll just say that it has to do with Helen, who was a Greek queen who was whisked away by Paris, a Trojan prince, taken to Troy, and supposedly this is what initiates this great naval invasion by the Greeks at Troy. So that's what the Iliad is about. The Iliad is about a short period of time at the end of the Trojan War, which the Greeks do win. Odysseus, who of course is the hero of the Odyssey, is a significant character in the Iliad, but he's not one of the major characters. He's not nearly as important as Achilles or Agamemnon on the Greek side, or Hector on the Trojan side. So he's there, but he's really in many ways a different kind of Odysseus than what we find in the Odyssey. I will say this about the Trojan War. For a long time, it was assumed the Trojan War was an entirely mythological event, no basis in history or fact whatever. But in the 19th century, archaeological excavations were carried out that do point to some kind of major battle that happened around the site of Troy around the time that the Trojan War supposedly took place, which is something like 1200 BCE. So the Trojan War itself is not purely mythological, but we can say that Homer's version of it, if you ever read the Iliad, Homer's version of it is certainly fiction. So worth bearing in mind. Somebody like Odysseus, really more of a mythological, fictional character than a real person, even if maybe loosely Odysseus was based on a historical figure. All right, well, as I've said, Homer is supposedly the author of both these works, the Iliad and its sequel, the Odyssey. So who is this Homer? We have no idea, really. Very mysterious figure. We'll probably never really identify him. And in fact, we know so little about Homer that we can't even rule out the possibility that Homer was actually a group of authors working together to compose these works. I'm not saying that's likely, but I'm just saying we can't rule that out. We can't even rule out that Homer was a woman. Okay, there were female authors in the ancient world, including the ancient Greek world, so who knows? Again, I don't think it's likely that Homer was a woman. But we know so little about Homer, we can't exclude that possibility as well. We can be a little bit more certain or on firmer ground talking about dates. So the prevailing view is that the Iliad was in fact written around 750 BCE, with the Odyssey written about 50 years later. And of course, that very time gap makes it less likely that the author of the Odyssey is also the author of the Iliad, right? I mean, it's possible, but I think a bit unlikely. So we just say these works were written by Homer because later Greeks attributed these works to Homer, and we're just sort of going with it. So they're written around the 8th century BCE. This is a time in which Greece has just exited its so-called Dark Age, when writing was lost, and I talked about this last week. So the Greeks had just sort of become literate again, and so for centuries, Greek culture was really an oral culture. And I don't need to say much more about this because Dr. Edmondson covers this in his lecture, which you'll be watching this week. But all scholars agree that whoever wrote the Odyssey, it was not as if the person just sat down one day and made it all up. Rather, the story that constitutes the Odyssey is likely a story that was told and passed down orally for many generations before it actually was written down in the form that we have it today. So again, look for more about the oral tradition in Dr. Edmondson's lecture. One other major point, and then I'll be done. The setting of the poem. Okay, we've talked about the time of Homer, but when is all this stuff supposed to be happening What time period was Odysseus supposed to be living? Well, I've already hinted at this, right? Because the fall of Troy is believed to have taken place around 1250 BCE or so. So it's really at the tail end of the Mycenaean period, which we talked about last week. That's the period that is being depicted in the Homeric epics. And so Homer is writing about events that took place probably at least 500 years in the past. And there's a real nostalgia, I think, going on here. And this is very typical of this kind of an epic. And I'll say something about epic in just a moment. You're writing about a far-off time when the men were stronger and the women were hardier and, so on and so forth. So Homer is writing about this great age of heroes towards the end of the Mycenaean period. But of course, there's no way that Homer, writing 500 years later, could really have a very accurate knowledge of the Mycenaean period. So the world he's describing in his poems actually are probably closer to the world of Dark Age Greece than the Mycenaean period. Mycenaean period, something like 2000 to 1200 BCE. This is just a refresher. Dark Age is something like 1200 to 800 BCE, something along those lines. So he's describing in many ways a kind of a made-up world, a world that never quite existed. Now, that's not to say that there's not important historical nuggets in the Odyssey, but we can't take the Odyssey, or the Iliad for that matter, as a straightforward reflection or depiction of any particular time period in Greek history. Because there are elements of the Mycenaean period that are present, there are elements of the Dark Ages Greece that are present, and so on. So Homer's world is a fictional world. That being said, we can learn a lot about ancient Greek culture from it, and that will be the focus, as I said before, of the third video lecture this week. Very last thing, just a little PS, and I'm done. The genre. I've already mentioned the genre. It is epic, and it's really important that you get a good handle on what an epic is, because this is the first of 3 epics that we will be reading this semester, or 3.5 if you count Ovid. So you need to know what an epic is, and Dr. Edmondson does a really clear job with that. So make sure you take really good notes, pay good attention to his lecture. That will help you a lot in navigating Homer. See you next time.